welcome to Required Reading, the podcast that revisits the most impactful books from our childhood. I'm your host, Erin Bowles. I am a writer, actor, and comedian, and our guest today is Kate Hagen. Kate is a writer and producer whose work has appeared in Playboy, Letterboxd, and more. In 2019, she brought her essay In Search of the Last Great Video Store to TEDx, and she also appears in The Last Blockbuster to discuss video store culture. She began working with The Blacklist as a reader in 2013 and is now an SVP and served as the co-creator of the Blacklist podcast. She also created the Diversity List initiative for the company. Absolutely incredible. Hello.
Hey, Erin. Thanks so much for having me. What a fun topic we get to chat about today.
I am so thrilled. From 1974 by Stephen King, his debut novel, Carrie. Carrie is a novel about a girl with telekinesis who is bullied by absolutely everyone and starts to have power and experience that, has an abusive mom. The movie came out 2 years after, although this book is set 5 years in the future, which I feel like I need to talk about.
Yeah, and like the flash forwards, I wasn't thinking about the first time I read it, but I was thinking about a lot about this time, and then we'll get to things like The Rage, Carrie too, but
yes.
Not yet.
Yes. Oh my goodness. I had seen the film but was so glad to finally read it. This is only my second Stephen King. The first one was Misery in October for this show. But so fascinating, such a page turner. What is your story with this book? How did it come into your life?
Yeah. So I was, like many of us, a very precocious child who was reading anything and everything I could get my hands on. And I was already sneaking stuff from my parents that I should not have been sneaking. And around the time that I was like 10 or 11 years old, my dad was like, because I was interested in kind of spooky stuff, but I was also extremely terrified of it. And my dad around that time was like, you should think about maybe reading Stephen King's fantasy novel, The Eyes of the Dragon, that he kind of wrote for his children. A couple of years before that had happened, though, I should put context, and we'll talk about the novel, but we also have to talk about the Brian De Palma movie. Let's be serious.
We have to.
I am 8 years old. I am a big old scaredy cat. I am terrified of everything. I have to like peek around the Halloween mask aisle as a kid because I'm so scared, but I'm also fascinated.
Yeah.
Like, I'm fascinated by this side of life. So Carrie is going to be on Joe Bob Briggs's Monster Vision on TNT Saturday night in the year 1998. I spent a lot of time at my Meemaw's house when I was a kid, and I could watch things unsupervised in the basement. So I decided that I am going to watch Carrie. Something I have to think the sort of outcast teenage girl thing even resonated with me as like a little kid. And I had seen the image of Sissy Spacek covered in blood, and I was absolutely repulsed and fascinated by it. I was just like, why is she in a prom dress and covered in blood? That's not good. And in a little kid brain, your mind can come up with all sorts of possibilities for that. So I got very brave. I watched the edited for television version of Carrie. It scared the absolute bejesus out of me. That was the point in my life where I was the most Catholic also. So all of the religious horror just, it terrified me. Still to this day, I think one of the most frightening images in cinema is crucified Margaret White in the house. But I watched the movie and it really kind of changed my life because I realized that I could watch a full horror movie and I would be so terrified by it, but it was also one of the most thrilling things I'd ever experienced at that point. And so I kind of opened Pandora's box, and then I started watching more horror movies. But okay, that's all prologue to 13-year-old Kate reading Carrie. I had read Eyes of the Dragon, and I was like, my parents are super cool, they're super permissive, and they were really good about like being like, you're ready for this. So we had just read To Kill a Mockingbird in 8th grade, and I was just like feeling kind of bored by some of the assignment stuff. And my mom, we were at a Half Price Books in Sharonville, Ohio, and she's like, you could maybe get another Stephen King book if you want. So I consider Carrie to be my first real Stephen King book. For the audience at home that can't see this, Here is my used mass market paperback of Carrie that I read when I was 13. And I still have the back has the movie tie-in with all the stuff about the De Palma movie. And like many people who started reading Stephen King at that age, I have such specific and particular memories about where I was, what the weather was like, just being completely put under the spell of this book. I want to say I read it the first time in like 2 or 3 days, and again was just like horrified and fascinated all at once.
What do you think makes it that sort of sticky at that age, that like really like that you can still have? And I mean, what are some of those memories of like the weather and all of it? What do you think about King or about this novel specifically? What makes it, and tying in, I mean, what made you want to come back to it now?
I think it's a couple of things. I can't remember if it's in the erotic 80s or erotic 90s series that Karina Longworth does on You Must Remember This, but she talks about this concept of there is a door. And when you are a child, you are aware that there are things behind that door that will become accessible to you when you are old enough, when you are ready to see what's behind that door. And ever since I was very little, I always wanted to know what was behind the door. Like, even when I would scare my pants off myself or just like see something I shouldn't have seen too young, I just wanted to know. Like, I've always had that. I think for me, what drew me to Carrie is kind of what I was hitting on, the juxtaposition of that, like, really beautiful, like, classic American femininity of, like, the prom queen and Sissy Spacek is such a sweet person. And what could she have possibly done to be covered in blood? I have memories of that back in the day, they used to have video rentals in grocery stores. And I remember being in a Thriftway in Cincinnati, and there was a rack of videotapes in the fall that was Carrie, Evil Dead 2, and Friday the 13th. And all three of them, I was just like, oh, I'm so frightened by this, but I also like I so badly want to know what's going on here. I think something that gets kind of forgotten when we talk about Stephen King is these books, a lot of them are a really good transition from sort of I'm a kid and I know that there is a big scary world out there, but I don't quite know what that looks like because I'm still kind of a kid. And I have talked to many other people who loved him in that kind of young adult phase. There's something about reading these books and feeling like you're getting a window, a peek behind that door into kind of the adult world and adult relationships and adult emotions and just the complexities of the way the world works in still a really digestible, easy to sort of onboard form because through the lens of genre, we're able to get to these really deep and sort of existential questions about how we live our lives through, this Carrie is very much a book about the war between freedom and desire and religion and repression. And if you don't have the sort of genre skin on it, not as many people are reading that book. I certainly, had I not seen her covered in blood, I wouldn't have been as interested by it. But specifically, I read this in the spring of, that would have been 2003. In my eighth grade English class, we had a terrible English teacher that year who like could not control the students. So I just turned that into like, I'm just gonna read all period. And I read after this really opened the Stephen King wave for me. In that era, I also read the Bachman books, the four short novels. And from there, we were just kind of off to the races. That summer, I read The Stand. The following summer, I read It. I was thinking about, there's a whole podcast to be done about things like racism and misogyny and fat phobia and Stephen King books. However, rereading this, I'm like, how did this man so effectively get into the mind of a 17-year-old girl?
Yes.
Which I think has a lot to do with Tabitha King and her influence, not just on this book, but his kind of body of work and his ability to navigate these points of view that he frankly doesn't understand is really remarkable. And it really struck me, not just in Carrie White's point of view, but Sue Snell and Chris Hargison's point of view in this reread of how did you know what made the mind of a teenage girl in 1975 tick like this, Stevie? But this was kind of kicked off my long-term love for Stephen King. I'm a constant reader. I haven't read all of the books. I've read a lot of them at this point. I love knowing that this is only your second Stephen King book and coming after Misery. I feel like these are great ones to start because they're like relatively contained when he loves
Yeah.
to sprawl.
I know. I'm really like, I know that there is like Castle Rock, Maine, and they're like all of these different things combining. I forgot this and I'm remembering it now, how much my understanding of Stephen King comes not from Stephen King but from In the Mouth of Madness, which is what if a Stephen King type author, all of his books exist in a real town somewhere, and a fantastic film. But I am really intrigued by that idea that like they're all connected somehow. I think there's like a toss away line in, and of course I know the movies, like he has a huge cultural impact that you just can't get away from. I think there's one line in Misery that references The Shining, and that is such a rewarding, like, to eat up all the little tidbits. But I'm really glad that you mentioned, like, how does he have this incredible understanding of what it is to be a teenage girl? And I hadn't thought about Tabitha King, his wife, at all, and I really want to circle back to that. But I think a huge part of it is that he, especially in this time when he comes straight out of college, he is a high school English teacher. And so I don't know like the exact timeline of like had he stopped teaching at this point because he moves, and but thinking about that, and because there's a new movie or series coming out about it, I thought there are a lot of former teachers who get into writing, and it's either that we really know like what will make kids perk up and pay attention in class, or we know the truth of what it is to be a kid, like the author of Lord of the Flies was a boy's like middle school teacher. And like you said, there's some things to trip over, in sort of cancel culture. There's a fly. There's a lot of talk about breasts in this book.
Yeah, dirty pillows as an epithet is used a lot. That man loves to write about boobs.
And I think that's a thing of like, oh, and you're also a high school teacher, but it's sort of a thing of like, it's there and we can't change it, and there's, the book has other merits. There's one really weird racist line at the end about Chris, I think, gets a swollen lip, and when it's like that, when it's just one thing that you could pull out, it's like, what? It feels so somehow stranger. Like there's one chapter in Harriet the Spy that is probably the most fatphobic thing I've ever read, and the book still functions completely well without it, and it's so weird that it is there. But yeah, it's also surprising how much of this book, I mean, it starts with it and then ends with this iconic image of Carrie covered in blood, but it's a story not only about puberty but specifically about menstruation. The whole book starts with Carrie is in the showers in gym class and gets her period and doesn't know what it is, and all of the girls start throwing tampons at her, including the mean girl Chris and Sue Snell, who was sort of the popular goody two-shoes, and second to Carrie. She's one of the most interesting characters because she goes, that I don't do that. Why did I partake in that? And trying to sort of wrestle with that, I thought was really interesting. And that King can do that whole spectrum of girlhood was really interesting.
Yeah, who would have guessed this guy from Maine was able to tap in? I think too, he was raised by a single mom, and I have to imagine that had an impact on the way he thought about things like periods versus if you're raised in like a family of, let's say, all men except for the mother. It's just a different level of understanding about women's bodies and how they work. What really hit for me on this reread, and I think, as a kid, you're sort of attuned to like, Carrie does a bad thing, but I'm still rooting for Carrie throughout this month. Whereas now I have such tremendous empathy for Sue Snell, and the fact that we all have these moments that you're like, oh my god, the mob mentality took over, I acted in an aberrant way, I now need to punish myself for that aberration because I know that's not me, versus somebody like Chris Hargensen who's literally getting off on torturing Carrie. And the idea that we get all these different women, it made me think a lot about his female characters in The Stand. Similarly, there's a young pregnant woman in The Stand named Fran Goldsmith, who's one of the major characters in the book. And what does Stephen King know about being a pregnant single mom in Maine? You know, he had a single mom in
Yeah.
Maine. For all the sort of demerits we can put on him
Hmm.
in 2026 lens, there are things like this that have aged so much better than they could have.
Yeah.
And I think it really speaks to his ability to create these really totemic, just like monolithic images. We are going to be talking about the opening scene of Carrie until the aliens come from
Yep.
us. There is
Hmm.
such power in the idea of a teenage girl gets a period and she doesn't know what it is. And instead of getting help for that, she's made a pariah by her classmates. It's got just this like mythic power that, hit me when I was 8 years old in the like edited for television version that's 1/10 of what it is in the
Yeah.
actual movie. And, even rereading this, it's like you still just like want to crawl into a hole when it's happening to Carrie. You're like, please leave her alone.
Yeah, and she has always been different. She's a senior in high school. She comes from an extremely abusive single mom who is, to say a religious fanatic feels so inadequate to Margaret White. And I just started getting into video essays, and one day I have to like sit down and go like, what is up with Annie Wilkes and Margaret White and these figures of like motherhood and maternity and extremism and puritanical, but that's for 10 years down the line from now. But you said that you were also, this was when you saw, or when you saw the movie first, or when you read the book, which is it that you were sort of in the most Catholic
When I
headspace.
saw the movie for the first
Oh,
time. So I still like the Jesus in the closet. Like
oh
if
my
I close
goodness.
my eyes and I think about the things that have scared me most in cinema throughout my life, that's one of the images. And it's, watching it now, you're just like, it is incredible. And I mean, I love Brian De Palma movies. That's a different podcast.
Hmm.
But his ability to take the best of the novel and really distill it into this excellent adaptation.
Hmm.
And we can get to the ending and the really smart choices that are made around that in translating it to the screen. But I think about it all the time. The fact that both in the creation of the novel and the creation of the film, it's this very male point of view that still gets to these fundamental truths. I mean, here we are in 2026, two
Hmm.
women talking about how much we love this thing that a bunch of dudes
I
made.
know.
I wonder about some of his sort of like single maternal characters, if
Hmm.
that's him thinking about his own mother and being like, okay, what's the worst case
Yeah.
scenario of her? Like, what if she was a terrible person? But yeah, and I think the religiosity throughout Carrie is one of those things that made it hit in the zeitgeist, even if you're
Mm.
not into horror novels, even if you're not into the idea of psychic powers, the idea of like a girl from a really strict religious background trying to break free of that is relatable to many people in many
Hmm.
different capacities, even if it's not religion you're trying to break free of, particularly at this moment in American history, kind of on the verge of things like Roe versus Wade and women being able to get credit cards, lest we forget that's only
Hmm.
50 years ago, guys. The idea that you could want more for yourself, that you could have actual desire and break free of whatever kind of mold had been set up for you.
Yeah. The most satisfying moments in the books are when Carrie uses her telekinesis to get one over on all of her bullies, but one of the most incredible moments is also Carrie talking to her mother, and it's devoid of telekinesis, but her saying like, I have seen your life and I don't want it. I think one of the coolest things about this book is that it's adults can be wrong. And I like to do a tiny bit of research into 1974. This is the year that Nixon resigns, so we're having this huge thing of like, we actually can't trust people in power, and what if they are fallible, and what do we do with that? And the thing that I was so blown over by, and how can King tap into this, is like the rage within it. And it must, as a young girl, be so empowering. I've been thinking a lot about, I'm editing an episode right now about a book about the Salem witch trials. And I think witches is so interesting to young girls because it is giving young girls power. in a way that we are sort of the most unempowered of, or often less powered. So I think Carrie is coming into her body and having so much power for a person who has been so disempowered, and how that comes with rage. We just don't see female rage a lot, and we should.
And ideally, the female rage is not coming at the expense of most of your high school classmates, most of your town, and your own mother. But sometimes you just snap, baby, and you have had it up to here. There are other characters in the sort of Stephen King oeuvre where we get to see that manifest. Nadine and The Stand popped into my head immediately, of just like what happens to a woman who is pushed too far finally, and what kind of tips her over the edge of that, and seeing the manifestation of what that actually looks like. Everything has to be situated in its proper historical context. It's really interesting thinking about this moment of like, you're coming out of the hippie dream. Vietnam has ended.
Yeah.
Quotation marks, I should add there. And it's the long bad 70s, and people are starting to have not a very good time, and we're seeing it manifest in young people too, who are making all sorts of not great decisions about how to move through the world because they're just so dispirited about the state of things. Sounds familiar. Feminine rage is one of the most potent emotions on God's green earth, and I'm always fascinated by art that really taps into that. And I think part of why this movie has stayed in the cultural consciousness for so long is because most of us have had moments where, even if we don't want to burn the high school auditorium down, we understand where Carrie is coming from.
Oh, yeah.
We have that power fantasy of just like, what if I could just explode all these people who are terrible to me? And you see it in something like Christine, in the character of Arnie, who thinks everybody is out to get him, and he's got this term for them. He calls them the shitters of the world, are out to get him. And I think for me, the thing that Stephen King is what makes him magic is that ability to tap into the end of childhood and that adult awareness that you're starting to have, but also you haven't fully lost that childlike sense of wonder and magic. And that's why we find so many of his protagonists at that sort of crucial moment in their lives when they're able to be like, you know what, I'm existing in both worlds for a minute still, and I'm gonna make the most of both of the having one foot in both worlds to do this kind of shocking, often supernatural thing that happens.
Yeah, I liked that you said earlier, we know Carrie is technically wrong, but we're there with her. I mean, because we've been there with her at least for the events of, I think it's just like the last couple months of high school. And she touches a tiny bit on like, when I was in 5th grade or something, they did this and they did that. But even within just the few little moments we see, it is from all sides. There is, even the acts of kindness are sort of self-motivated. Sue Snell tells her boyfriend to take Carrie to the prom, and he seems like a great guy. Like, even to the end of the book, he seems like a good, well-rounded person, and yet King, through the character of Sue, reminds us, like, this is still a selfish thing. This is still Sue trying to make herself feel better about her participation in that shower sequence. So I think it's great that, like, especially reading it in 2026, like, gray area is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and that it can be both. Like you were saying, that you can exist in childhood and the adult world. I think it's comforting to grow up and be like, I know this to be true, and someone is reflecting it back to me.
Yeah, and like you said about that moment when you're like, wait a minute, the adults aren't right just because the adults. They're not automatically correct. And I think we see that through Carrie's sort of realization about her mom and the life that her mom has created for her, and how it didn't in fact have to be that way. It's a really common theme. And I don't know, I think about, there's a line in the Cassavetes movie opening night, Jenna Rollins' protagonist character is talking about getting older, and she's like, when I was 16, all of my emotions were right at the surface. I could tap into them so easily, and now they're so elusive to me and they're so far away. And it's true. I mean, that age, everything, whether it's lust or rage or hunger or alienation, it's just turned up to 7,000, and you have to make sense of it and also do your homework and go to prom.
Yeah, you have so much sympathy for Carrie that like even reading it, I'm creeping towards 30, and it's like I don't care that it's wrong. One of the things that is not in the movie, and it, like, for understandable reasons, but that I loved about this book is that it is both. I mean, some people say it's like semi-epistolary, and I'm like, I don't know, because epistolary is letters, blah, blah, blah. That's getting real nitpicky. But that you'll see Carrie's life for a minute, and then it's like from the Carrie White commission in Congress, and then a newspaper article, and then multiple textbooks written about Carrie. So that, I think, is so just a fascinating way to structure any book, and I wish we had more often. And also that, like, it's his first novel, and what a kind of banger way to come into the I mean, he had published a couple short stories, but, like, what a way to assert yourself. And, like, as a young creative, I mean, you're a writer. A lot of people have spoken to seeing books that play with form and being like, I didn't know you could do that. So not only is it, adults are wrong, it's also that, like, you can bend convention and break convention. Yeah.
And you understand why this kind of made a splash at the time too, right? Like, we're reading all these very sort of stodgy great American novels, and this is a great American novel, but it's also fun as hell. And, I think King gets a bad rap generally for being too much of a popcorn novelist. I think if he was just all sort of surface, we would not be talking about these books 50 years later. I don't know where this came from, but I've held on to it for years. The idea that horror gives us the language to speak about things that are unspeakable. And
absolutely.
I think we see that in a lot of his work. What is the vehicle for an alienated teenage girl's rage? Well, what if she could turn it into telekinesis? What if we did that? I had forgotten how much of the novel is in this sort of epistolary form.
Yeah.
And I remember as a kid reading it, being really surprised, having seen the movie first, that there were all these kind of digressions, and sort of like the 30,000 foot view, because so many of his other novels were kind of situated with a single protagonist, and we follow them throughout. And, books like The Stand and It do similar techniques in terms of we have a lot of different POV characters. We have these sort of long digressions into whether it's a letter or a historical record or history of something. And it's interesting seeing him find his footing with that kind of style in a book like this. I believe this was intended to be a short story first. Famously, he threw it away, and Tabby dug it out of the trash can.
I didn't know that.
He wrote the opening scene and was like, this is trash. Nobody's ever going to read this. And Tabby was like, I'm sorry, there's something here. And shout out to Stephen King, who has always been really, really direct and complimentary towards her influence on his work, and particularly as it pertains to female characters. So thank you, Tabitha King, for picking these pages out of the trash can.
Yeah, the book is dedicated to her, and I think a lot of his books are. I was thinking about this earlier today of, like, when the Bo Burnham's movie 8th Grade came out, I loathed it, and I felt so talked down to. I felt like, how dare you try to tell me my experience, and you get it wrong, and I had all of these, I was surrounded by guys who were all like, it's incredible, and yet here we are, and I don't want to rewatch 8th Grade, I'm not going to do that, but, like, here we have it of, he really gets it and treats it with empathy, and maybe it's that, like, I don't know how to like point to it, but maybe it's that, like, Stephen King approaches it with, like, I'm not gonna get all of it right, and I don't know everything, and there are gray areas. Well, maybe the difference is that Carrie gets power in this one and really gets to act it out, and that is certainly not the case in 8th Grade. And also genre, that's probably a huge thing about it too, like you were saying, that we are I'm reading Vampire Academy 2 right now for this podcast, and there was a line that's like, hey, high school is hell, and it's just like, it's very affirming when someone tells you that. Absolutely.
I wish somebody would have told me that. And even if you sort of know it intellectually, understanding it on a cellular level is a very different thing. And, most of us, I don't think, have seen our classmates go full telekinetic powers at prom, but most of us, too, can point to moments in our high school experience where somebody just snaps in a very major and public way that feels really aberrant to what everybody else is doing. And then you sort of have to, with your poor little teenage brain, make sense of it, along with the adults who also don't really know how to make sense of it. You know, when I was in high school, we had a very popular student get killed in the Iraq War. And that was one of the moments where I was like, oh, we don't know what to do as a student body, but you know who really doesn't know what to do is the teachers and the administration, and seeing them sort of flail and make not the best decisions in some circumstances was a really clarifying moment to be like, oh, they don't know it all and we don't know it all.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. I can work with that.
Yeah. We also they're brief, but especially in the beginning, we get those insight moments into some of the adults, and they are comedic, they're also fumbling, and that there are also, you know, there's this figure of the coach who's like a first year teacher. She's there during the shower sequence, and she is like, I got it wrong, and it's really, really troubling me. And she tries to, in the way that Sue does, to make amends for it. She's like really harsh on all of the girls who bullied Carrie, and it's not enough, and that is just something you have to live with, and Sue has to live with. And Sue's one of the only characters who makes it out alive. If I remember correctly, it's not in the movie, but there's a very long sequence about how Carrie also goes through the town and burns down the town, and I liked that too. I mean, King has these incredible visuals, and he is, you said, sort of popcorn books. Popular things succeed because they speak to something. You know, even if they are vapid and shallow, there's still something like that resonates, and that is worth examining. And this is certainly meaty more than a lot of things are.
Yeah, and you know, I completely understand why it was impractical to like burn an entire small town down in the film.
It, yeah.
It's a really smart choice to not do that in the movie. And I find one of the saddest and scariest sequences in the movie to be when Carrie comes home post-prom and she's covered in blood and she's not really engaging with Margaret yet, and she takes the bath and she's just sort of reckoning with what she's done, and she kind of cleans herself up and, you know, kind of wants to be mothered, and Margaret's not having it, and that's what really flips the switch. And I don't know, I think, you know, the destruction of the town really works in the novel, and I think gets into some interesting thematic territory of like, I'm destroying my motherland, I'm destroying the very soil which raised me. But at the same time, you know, Margaret is the only church she's ever known, and the destruction of Margaret in the movie is I would argue more impactful than seeing the whole town burn down in really graphic detail. Whereas Margaret's death in the book is a little bit more subtle and downplayed, and it's not quite as bombastic. And I think that's one of those adaptation choices that you just have to be like, yeah, great job, guys. Like, that was, it was a really savvy way to move through this. Oh, I was going to say something else about something you said, and it has fallen out of my brain. So
it's going to come back.
Yeah.
It'll come back. Yeah, it's not in the movie because it's, you know, outside of the, when Carrie dies, she's outside this roadhouse, and Sue is there with her, and you know, that scene stayed with me a lot more than Margaret's actual death, where Carrie is like calling for her mom. And even with all of that, I mean, you said that Margaret is the only church that Carrie's ever known. There's a line that's like, Margaret was the preacher and Carrie was the congregation. There, you mentioned really early on, and it's done well in the movie, that like Carrie's punishment is to sit in a closet, and it's not that the closet is dark, there is a light on, which is maybe worse. And all of these posters of and paintings of Jesus, and that she, you know, soils herself and she wets herself when she's in there, and she wants to be really strong, but then like 3 hours in, she is calling for her mom. The most devastating moments are the ones where like you're reminded about how young they are. There's a line in, you know, Sue writes a book that is intercut through it, and she says like, we were kids. That's the most important thing to remember. We were kids. Just devastating.
And I think that's part of why I like rankle at the like Stephen King only writes popcorn novels.
Yeah.
Like, Does he, or is he taking the emotions of groups of people that are historically diminished really seriously? Like in the case of something like It, you have this losers club of 7 misfit children who find each other, and they all are going through various forms of isolation and alienation and abuse, and they come together and they're able to find this like magic together. And I think there's something really, really potent in his work that really understands that older child teenage experience of like, oh no, I do have some power here. I don't have all the power, but I have some power, and I'm going to work with that. I think the way in which he really digs in on the religious themes in this book and the destruction of Margaret's the way that Margaret uses religion to destroy her life and Carrie's life is so relatable, and something that so many people, even if you're not a horror person, even if you're not a Stephen King person, you can really just find yourself in that. One of my favorite aspects of both the book and the movie is the great reveal with Margaret White when they're talking about Carrie's father, and her whole thing is like, Carrie has gotten her period because Carrie has sinned in some way. First the blood comes and then the boys come. And then you have this revelation by Margaret in kind of the third act of both of like, you know what? I did fuck your dad and I did like it. And like, this moment for both of them of just being like, I did want to sin and I did like it and I did have that desire. And we see it a little bit with Carrie. I've always thought it's a really smart choice that we don't see more of Carrie's sexual coming of age and beyond getting her period. Like, can you imagine if she was like making out with Tommy? How false that would feel. And I appreciate that we sort of get to see that through Margaret's experience, and the idea that like Margaret enjoyed sex so much it terrified her to the point that she was like, I need to fully abstain from this and any kind of sinful life full of desire, because I can't admit to myself that I do really want this thing and I do want men. Again, Stephen King, incredible stuff for a 30-something English teacher in Maine.
Yeah, I think he might have been like even less than 30. I think he might have been like late 20s. And I think the character of Margaret, and maybe not like in a historical timeline kind of sense, but is really revolutionary in that like talking first about like liking sex and the horror that comes with that when you were in such a patriarchal, restrictive, I mean, that must have been in the 50s that Margaret was, was a young person, and that women and mothers can be physically abusive, and that some of the most horrifying moments of Margaret's abuse towards Carrie is obviously the horrible physical, abuse that she inflicts on Carrie, but also that she starts abusing herself and she starts tearing at her own skin. And then Carrie is like, oh, don't hurt yourself, Mom. Now I'm causing that to happen. I think that is, there's also like, I mean, he deals with domestic violence a little bit with the relationship of Chris and her kind of like greaser boyfriend, Billy, but that can be violent also, and that Chris kind of likes the violent sex and then doesn't, and then is wrestling with that. There's just so much gray area that I think women especially are not really allowed to partake in.
Still, to this very day. I mean, that's such a great scene, the way it's translated in the movie with Chris and Billy when they go to the slaughterhouse to get the pig's blood and then they have sex afterwards, and you're like, oh, interesting. These people are getting off on things that people don't typically get off on.
Yeah.
And, I appreciate that a character like Chris, even though the book sort of punishes her because she is horrible, doesn't necessarily make moral judgments about things like her sex life, or Sue for that matter, right? Like, there's the sequence with Sue and Tommy where she's talking about, she's like, yeah, we're having sex. It's not that fun. It's not that enjoyable. But then they have, this really sort of honest conversation, and suddenly sex is enjoyable for Sue. And just getting to some of these, like, like you said, frankly, pretty radical concepts for 1974, particularly with young women. It makes me wonder what year Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret was published.
We can find this out.
Yeah.
I'll look this up.
Very different book tonally, but the idea that it's like Guys, girls are thinking all the same things boys are. They just don't get to talk about it. And, you know, even within abuse and domestic violence, I think Stephen King has a lot of empathy for his villains. And you certainly, even if you can't relate to Margaret, you understand why she has become the way she's become. Can you imagine being pregnant out of wedlock in the 50s and then kind of having to dig your heels in on this like fundamentalist Baptist adjacent church to make it make sense in your own brain? To me, one of the most heart-wrenching scenes in the movie is after, you know, as you said, when she's calling out for her mother at the kind of roadhouse finale in the book, and similarly in the movie, after she's killed Margaret, you know, she kind of like embraces her and tries to take her out of the crucifixion tableau that she's put her in, and she's calling for mommy. It's like, you know, this horrible woman who has mistreated me in a myriad of ways, and it's still my mom, and I still have to learn to live with that. Like, it's really deep stuff. I mean, it is fundamentally a book about child abuse. He was given some very naughty things through this vehicle of genre.
Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret was 1970, only 4 years before this.
Wow. Okay. Interesting, because this kind of feels like the next Pokemon evolution. Okay. I don't know. I think about too, my mom was a girl during this time, and she's told me about like having her copy of The Exorcist confiscated by my grandmother, having her copy of Helter Skelter confiscated by my grandmother, and the idea that women are just starting, you know, in the mid 70s to be able to be like, no, I want that. I'm interested in what's behind the door, even if society doesn't want me to be interested. I want to look. I remember stories from my grandmother. She was raised, Cincinnati is very Catholic, and she was raised in a very traditional Catholic household. Two of her friends, when they got their periods, ran screaming to their mothers because they were like, I'm dying. This is it. I don't know what's happened, but I'm going to die because I'm bleeding. Coming of age can mean so many different things. That obviously for different cultures, they mark coming of age with different moments. But whether you get your period when you're 10 years old or 18, it is a mark of something. It's that mark of that jump into actual sort of reproductive adulthood, even if you're not biologically, socially, etc., anthropologically at that age. And, you know, I think part of the reason these Stephen King books stick in everyone's craw is because they hit on those very sort of universal generational experiences. Something like Stand By Me, right? Like, everybody has a first time they see a dead body. Like, you know, we all remember, like, you may have encountered death, you may have had people that you lost, but you definitely remember the first dead person you saw. And just speaking to those moments in which kind of childhoods end, even if childhood isn't even actually over yet, it really, I think, resonates through the generations because of that.
Yeah. Carrie's body is changing, and there's in some of these like academic pieces folded into it, there's like, and we think it's a recessive gene, and we think it's like in the lymphatic system or something in the hormones, and I think there's something about like, oh, this awful, you know, because I think menstruation is kind of awful. I know some people want to be like, no, it's beautiful, and I'm like, no, I've experienced it and it sucks. It actually sucks. My last period, I was a stone cold asshole 2 weeks ago, and what if like along with it came something really cool and you got a secret superpower? And you know, I think people try to sell it as like, no, it's beautiful because now your body is able to create a whole nother human. And I'm like, no, it sucks, and that's okay. That's okay that it
it's
sucks.
a biological reality that can create magic but can also bring a lot of misery. There's certainly other equivalents in the body when poor Gordy gets a leech on his genitals and then just has to like navigate through that. You know, all these kind of strange, peculiar coming of age moments where your body is changing, you don't know quite what to do with that, but you know something is happening, and the adults in your life are not giving you the guidance that you need. So you turn to your peers and the other kids around you to try to make sense of the horrors.
Yeah. And Carrie doesn't have any peers, which is so... I don't know, you see a lot of misfit stories, but I think this is just the most painful. And yeah, when Carrie is calling out for her mom at the end, it's like, we all want our mom and we all want that, but it's also like, that is all she has. That is all she has. And I think her dad dies like real early. I don't know if they even really go into it, but well, and something that like the film is such a great adaptation. It really sticks in your mind. But you posted about this just a couple hours ago. Sissy Spacek is a little waif, and Carrie is not a little waif.
And like, look, Sissy Spacek in that role, I can't really fathom anybody else
No.
who could have done a better job with that part in 1975. None of this is to malign Sissy Spacek or Brian De Palma. I absolutely understand the decisions were made the way they were made. That said, I think every adaptation of Carrie has been a fundamental betrayal of the novel. There is something unique and potent about growing up as a fat girl and being fat for your entire childhood, adolescence, that just, unless you've had that experience, you don't know what it is like. And I have always really appreciated the bravery with Carrie. And, Stephen King has got some other issues with fat phobia and particularly fat women villains, whether it's Misery, whether it's Eddie Casbrack's mom and It. I could keep going forever. But I think his sort of portrayal of fat characters comes from this place of the outsider to society. And here we are 50 years after the book is written, and we still don't have a fat Carrie on screen. They're getting, again, not to malign Mike Flanagan, big fan of his work. We're doing another Carrie adaptation, and she's still just like a beautiful waif who,
Oh,
like,
who is it?
she maybe needs to pluck her eyebrows or something. But it's just, I don't know. It feels like a fundamental betrayal of that character and her sort of social experience of moving through the world as a kid, as a teenager. The ostracization that comes when you are not only the biggest girl in your class, but the biggest kid in your class, when you're bigger than the boys before the boys sort of start growing up. Oh my God, there's just nothing like that. Like there is, no other experience can match that particular experience. And I think in this novel, King has a lot of empathy for Carrie, whereas that wavers with some of the more villainous fat characters as you go deeper into his bibliography. But the adaptation of Carrie is about as good as an adaptation can get. I think the Rage Carrie 2 is crazy underrated as well. But I just think we're still sort of missing the secret sauce of what makes the novel special. And I think there are moments that would hit a lot harder.
Yeah.
Like if Tommy takes Fat Carrie to prom, that is like a real disruption to the social order of things. It's
Yeah.
not something that is done. If Carrie looks beautiful as a fat woman at prom, again, we are disrupting the narrative about the way things work and who gets to do certain things. And it just feels like a real missed opportunity to not dig into that. Maybe we'll get there one day,
I
but I'll
know.
keep hoping.
I know. It like at the pace that things are going, it does feel like, well, when Carrie turns 100, maybe then, you know? But you're
Yeah.
right. It's like there's even a line when Carrie is elected prom queen that's like, and I think it's echoed maybe earlier in the book, that it's like we all know how it is supposed to go for Carrie White. We
Yeah.
all know what is supposed to happen, and this is not it. And it's, yeah, I mean, I just put out a video essay about Wuthering Heights, so it's like in the zeitgeist. But it is like putting a white Heathcliff. It's like, well, you fundamentally don't understand what this is about. There's even a line in this novel that's like, why do we even hate Carrie? Like, what was her original sin? And it
Yeah.
is that she's different. And I think, like, I'm never gonna say Sissy Spacek is anything other than phenomenal. But you look at her and it's like, you look like the popular girl. Like, what is it here? And again, like, this is Laurence Olivier's Heathcliff for me as well. Is like, I think this is partly just me as a human being, and also just the way that humans function. Like, we are a visual people, so those visualizations, like, I'm reading this and I know it's saying that Carrie is fat, but Sissy Spacek is there in my head.
Yeah. It was shocking to me as a kid to find out she was fat, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and it was really cathartic too, to be like, oh, because, like, I don't know, most of us can relate to alienation, isolation, melancholy in high school. It is one thing to experience those, it is another thing to experience those in a body that is fundamentally different than your
Mm-hmm.
peers. And that can mean a lot of different things beyond just being fat. But I feel like there's some really rich, as you said, visual territory in addition to thematic territory that
Mm-hmm.
somebody could really dig into. Also, okay, I'm not going to talk too much about the Rage Carrie 2, but I will tell you, if you're like, ugh, the 1999 Carrie sequel, what were we doing, folks? If you
I
have
did
not,
not know one existed before you are telling me about it now. I did not know.
I hadn't seen it since it came out, basically. And I rewatched it this year. That movie has aged like fine wine. It
Really?
predicts the sort of teen culture of I'm going to film you in an intimate moment, and then I'm going to disseminate that video to our peers and the aftermath of that. And it does something really interesting with this sort of concept of they're all going to laugh at you. We also get Amy Irving returns as an adult Sue Snell, and you get to see the sort of
Wow.
impact. I love Kat Shea. Kat Shea also directed Strip to Kill and Poison Ivy, which I would argue are also incredibly subversive, despite what the VHS box art might suggest. I don't know. I would love to see more women be able to play in this particular sandbox besides Kat Shea. That's 25 years ago.
Mhm.
And get into a lot of those girlhood experiences that I just don't think we've quite fundamentally captured about this novel yet.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to say that I know the entire spectrum of film history, but the prom queen image here with Carrie, I mean, I obviously it's there in Jennifer's body. If it is a thing that we have carried into media that has been made by women, and yet like we still don't have the original thing for ourselves, is really that's such a good point that I never even considered.
There's so
That
many people that could, I don't know. I am glad we're in a second, third, fifth Stephen King
yeah.
adaptation renaissance in my lifetime, but I think we could do some more unique takes on the book at this
Yeah.
point, guys. We've kind of seen the standard adaptations in many cases. Let's have a little bit fun with it. Let's maybe remember what happens in the original novels. Like one of my pet obsessions, I'm like, again, let a woman make a misery movie. Like, let me
Oh,
sympathize with Annie Wilkes. Let me
yeah.
be like, oh, it was horrible, and I absolutely understand she made some points too.
Oof, yeah. Yeah, I'm very I mean I was this way when I read Misery. It's a whole oeuvre that I really want to get into. Why do you think he sets this in the future? This comes out this is
Hmm.
set 5 years. Well, actually, the events of the novel are in 79, 5 years after it's published, and then you have all of this like academia written presumably into the 80s. I mean, it has to be into the 80s. So maybe we're even meant to be reading this in the 90s. Why do you think that happens? I don't know.
I wonder if it was part of what you were hitting on of he didn't really want to talk about things like Vietnam or Nixon, and he felt like if he set the book contemporaneously to 1974, it would feel like, okay, we have to talk about those things, but nobody knows what the future holds. And I do think it's interesting though, like the end of the 70s, a very bleak period in America, much like today. People are really bottomed out in some really major ways, and the idea that, like, we could see this kind of teenage rage turned deadly on this really grand scale, I think gets at some of the kind of nebulous ideas people had about teenagers run amok in the
Right.
suburbs. And there's a great movie called Over the Edge from the late 70s that gets into that kind of same idea. But I also wonder if it's not, Stephen King loves to play with time, and time is always very elastic in his novels. And it makes me think of even some of the more modern stuff like 11/22/63, that is all about this kind of time travel device
Right.
around JFK's assassination, or like it when we're going not only back to their childhood if in the 50s from the 80s, we're going back to like colonial times in Derry to see like the
Mhm.
origin of Pennywise. I don't know. I think maybe that's one of the ways he finds creative freedom, is to be able to not feel bound to a particular year. And I think the fact that we're still adapting these books goes to show what a timeless quality they have, no matter when they're
Yeah.
set.
I didn't know that Mike Flanagan is doing a Carrie, and for a person I love, I do love his work. I am also like, is it? Do we need it? I know that Chloe Grace Moretz was in Carrie, like when I was in high school or something. How have we still not had a book accurate Carrie?
Yeah, and again, like the studio machine makes all sorts of decisions. We could do a whole nother podcast
Yeah.
about how fat actors don't get the opportunity to play actually fat parts because they're not seen as financeable by studios because of Western Eurocentric standards of beauty, among other things. But we have made enough kind of straight adaptations of these Stephen King books. We can do some more interesting stuff with it. I am really eager to see the Francis Lawrence adaptation of The Long Walk, which to me was like maybe the last remaining truly great Stephen King book that had never been adapted, and I'm curious to see what they did with it.
Was that the one that came out last year?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard good things, but yeah, I did not see it. And I have limited knowledge of Stephen King. I'm looking at my notes because there's not a ton of stuff here, but I wrote down, there's a quote when Carrie comes into the prom. People are receiving her well. She looks so pretty. And someone says, like, oh, they won't even recognize you. And she goes, I want them to know me. And I think that was like, there's moments where she's talking to her mom about, she's facing down this very normal teenage thing of like, when I finish high school, what do I do? Like, if college is not in my future, what is? And she's facing down like, do I just watch movies with my mom every single night? And she goes, I think these are in the same scene. She says, I want to be a whole person. I want to be let to live my own life. And it's always those, like you were saying, genre lets us really voice those deeply typical, monotonous, very difficult to talk about emotions. I think those are some of the moments that really sing.
Yeah, and I want to say in the movie, it's shifted a little bit, and she says, I want to be a real person, mama, which is, the idea that she's just been kind of suspended in this weird religious abusive amber. And there's a line in the book about how she has a sort of red circle around her, and anything she can do to sort of like diminish the power, the vibrance of that red circle, so she's a little bit less ostracized and a little bit less of a pariah. And I will say this reread got me thinking about some of the really religious kids that I went to school with and what kind of adults they turned out to be like. The kids who were not allowed to watch things like Disney movies when we were 12 years old because it was satanic. Are they still doing that at 35 years old? Have they deviated? Have they found a middle ground that works for them? We are not in a particularly religious moment in America outside of the heartland, but it is interesting thinking about just like one generation ago, how much more of an impact religious and religious structures had on how we all lived our lives.
Yeah, I mean, religion wasn't gigantic where I grew up, mostly because it was just such a diverse area, but I grew up with kids who weren't allowed to read Harry Potter. In second grade, there was a girl who was not allowed to read Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, a book about Jesus, because it had witch in the title. Yeah, and you say we're not in a particularly religious moment, and my immediate thought was like, yet.
We'll see. I should qualify too. I feel like a lot of people think they are doing that old time religion and they are doing something completely off the map. I think I'm thinking about religion more in the sort of
the traditional
and social tradition that your life is sort of structured around the church and the potlucks and the Sunday Mass and the First Communion. And there are certainly plenty of people in America and many other parts of the world that live their lives that way still, but it is different, I think, and is changing generationally the role in which that kind of organized religious gathering holds for us all.
Yeah. Now I'm thinking like, there's got to be like Christian TikTok. I don't know. I was buying highlighters the other day, and suddenly all of the results were Bible highlighters for Bibles. And I was like, oh, what a,
One of my good friends was raised pretty hardcore Baptist when we were kids and has a good deal of trauma from that, understandably. Mm-hmm. And she found a whole segment of TikTok called Rapture Talk, of people who are obsessed with, I gotta get right with God before we all get raptured, which of course the data's changed on a number of times now, understandably, for the rapture. It is fascinating to see the way in which people move through the world. And I do think we've had a return to spirituality and spiritualism.
That's true.
As they did in the 20s in America when things are going really bad and, systems and structures aren't serving you, but you are looking for deeper meaning in this really fucked up world that we find ourselves in. And it's like, where do you turn? You turn to maybe some alternative methods of spirituality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There is a crystal store nary a mile from me. Yeah, there's it. Whatever makes you happy.
It's a weird world out there, guys.
As long as they're not hurting anyone with their crystals. They're not hurting anyone at all. But yeah, you talked about that. I mean, were there any other things that you were really surprised by, or that you had forgotten, or that you viewed differently?
I will
Yeah.
say, whether it's watching the movie or reading the book, it's kind of a slight story plot wise. So many of his other novels, there's so much happening in all these divergent plot threads that sometimes come together better than other times. But this is really like a couple of big incidents and then we're done. And that's it. And I think that's kind of fascinating too, the idea that it's like, and I think this is kind of him as a baby writer too, maybe being like, okay, well, I know the prom happens and I know the period happens, and I really don't need that much musculature in between the two things. And trusting his instincts to not, like, I can see a later version of this novel where we have like a 200-page digression into Margaret White's marriage. And listen, I love that stuff and things like it when we go on the like, let's read a 50-page historical digression about the town of Derry. But it's really strong writerly instincts that he knew just enough to include, and that he didn't have to go whole hog with some of this. Sorry for making a pig pun talking about Carrie. I had forgotten that we end on a note about a completely different family and
Yeah.
possibly telekinetic child. And I really appreciate the idea that, Carrie is seen as this like one-off, cannot be explained phenomenon. Horrifying miracle is maybe the term for it. And then, you find out that Carrie's not alone. There's plenty of other people like Carrie. I love that bit in that final letter when it's a family in Appalachia and talking about like, well, grandma had the sight too. And my dad's family is from that part of the country, and I definitely had like a great aunt who was supposed to be touched and did all sorts of stuff, which was really fascinating as a kid to sort of see how that manifested practically. And, I think this idea that feminine rage is like a one-off sort of like cannot be replicated, to your point about like young girls not having power and things like witchcraft allowing them to take some of that power back. The idea that it's like all women possess this tremendous power and it's just very few of us get to really exercise that in the real world. And sometimes it's a 3-year-old in Appalachia that doesn't know what to do with it yet, and sometimes it's Carrie White who knows
Yeah.
exactly what to do with it at the right time. What a bold choice to end the novel on. The movie has a capital P perfect ending as well, but it's a distinctly cinematic creation, and I think this is in its own way almost scarier when you really
Yes.
grapple with it in total.
Yeah. Well, I think that makes me think about two things. And the first is that when I was looking into Misery, I was looking at a couple like negative reviews that came out at the time. I was looking into sort of how King talks about his process, and of course that's much later. That's like at least 10 years. But he says that he thinks of sort of like an incident or a conflict or a scene or an idea, and in the reviews people were sort of criticizing like these characters are a bit flat, which I disagreed with. So what's interesting about Carrie is that it is, like you said, there's not a lot of plot. This is a character. This is 100% based on what is happening within and around this person. So I thought that was really interesting. And I think also like with the Appalachia family and a lot of sort of these academic inserts, there is, at least in like one of the voices, this persistent thing of like, we have to study this because it could happen again. And I don't want to like make a huge belabored point about it, but now I'm sort of connecting dots with like school shooters.
Yeah.
And like you do have Carrie annihilate her whole school with the exception of, a handful of kids who can get out. And also like school shooters are always guys. And so how do you like rectify that with gender and that we were talking about menstruation and how people want to make it a miracle of like you can create life, but also women can take it away.
Yeah.
And the revolutionariness of not only Margaret White but like Annie Wilkes. There is just so much here to dig into. And coming back to the movies, like, so why haven't we all the way?
It didn't occur to me until you said it just now, but the juxtaposition of we have all these academic journals and inserts versus this very rural family that they
Yeah.
haven't read any of those academic texts. They just know that the little girl has the sight like Meemaw had the sight,
And there's all of these typos and like misspell or not type
Yeah.
misspellings and yeah.
I don't want to digress too much on this, but Stephen King does have a story about a school shooting. It's
Oh,
called
okay.
Rage. It's one of the Bachman books. Right after Columbine, he took it out of circulation. So you can only read it in out of print copies. And, unfortunately, he really predicted what was coming in the 80s and 90s with violence in schools. And the character that we follow in Rage, who has taken his high school classroom hostage at gunpoint, is not terribly far removed from what we would think of as that sort of archetype in 2026 terms. And, what a burden to be given the gift of sight like Stephen King, to sort of be able to look at all these cultural and social elements and say, unfortunately, I think that's where we're going. And that's where we did go. And I've always given him a lot of credit for just being like, you know what? I wrote this and I did predict the future. But you know what doesn't need to happen? Nobody needs to read this as a blueprint anymore.
Yeah.
Like, you can find it if you really want to look for it, but we're not going to make it easily available. And I think, some of that future casting is what we see in Carrie too. It's just like,
Yeah.
oh, Carrie only had she barely had a handle on what to do with this. What happens when the next girl really figures out what to do
Really
with it?
figures it out. Yeah. And I mean, like you said, when we started recording, like, genre gives us the way to talk about it. Like, if Carrie had a gun, it would not be as impactful, I think, because the genre, then there's no like metaphor to it, and the metaphor, I think, is how we understand it a lot better, is by externalizing it and putting it into a way that is a little, oops, I dropped my fidget thing. But yeah, definitely, I can leave it. I can be I can be a big boy.
Also, you guys, you don't need to read Rage. I've read Rage. It's a powerful little novella. You've lived the last 25 years in America. You get the vibe. I can't, in good conscience, recommend it for it. You can find it if you want it, but you don't need to read it. That said, all the other stuff in the Bachman books, absolutely fabulous, including The Long Walk, The Running Man, and the other great Stephen King book I am amazed hasn't been adapted yet, Roadwork. But maybe we'll get there one day.
Yeah, it's astonishing, just like the cultural impact that he has made and the output. One day I'll read On Writing. It's rotting on my shelf.
Oh, I'm excited for you. It's one of those books that you're like, it can't be that revelatory. What's he going to possibly say about writing that I don't already know? And then you read it and you're just like,
oh.
And that's why he's Stephen King. I can't remember what the exact page count is, but he has a very particular page count that he has to read.
Oh, yes, per day.
And he can write exactly that. He can write 500 pages beyond it. Like, whatever, he just has to hit that page count. And On Writing is a great lesson in yes, it's talent. Yes, it's ability, but it's also just sitting down in the chair and pumping out the pages every day. That's what being a writer is.
Yeah. I know. I need to do that. I need to do that today. Wow. Did you reread it a lot as a kid?
No, this was the only second time I reread it. I have read The Stand and It both 2 times as well, and a couple of the smaller other things. I would recommend, there's a great audio book of It that Steven Weber reads that is a real feat of voice acting if you're so inclined.
Oh, I think I had that on hold on Libby for a long time, and I don't know what happened to it. Well, would you consider it required reading?
Yeah, I mean, I was just having this conversation with friends about how there is the canon, and the canon is so straight, white, and male, and then there are all these alternative canons for anybody who isn't that. And we were talking specifically about The Bell Jar and Sylvia Plath, and the fact that it's been 60 years, we still don't have a great Bell Jar movie. One of the most important books about girlhood and depression and darkness that anybody has ever written, and we still don't know what to do with it 60 years later. I think the more we can speak about the unspeakable, particularly for folks that are not from that very sort of traditional straight male point of view, the more we have to remember those stories. I find this book cathartic at 36. I found it cathartic at 13. I think to be a woman in the world is to walk around with a lot of rage, disappointment, frustration every single day. Yeah. And we so rarely get the chance to do anything with that because it's quote unquote not ladylike. And there is something incredibly powerful of finding yourself in Carrie White and being able to say, it's a tagline for some movie. Here is a man who would not take it anymore. Here is a woman who would not take it anymore. And I think too, being able to see yourself in the other characters, whether it's Margaret or Chris or Sue, is just, even if you're the boy, maybe you find yourself in Tommy and the fact that he's just trying to do the right thing. He's just trying to be a better human and a less shitty teenage boy than his peers. There's a lot of different ways into this novel, and I do think it's one of those kind of, even if it's not a classic coming of age like A Catcher in the Rye or The Bell Jar, it gets at so much of that teenage seesaw reality and uses genre in a way to do it that somehow makes it feel more grounded, which is pretty incredible.
Exactly. Well, I think that for a lot of, and depending on age and your relationship to literature, whatever, Carrie is going to be a lot more accessible for a lot of girls than Bell Jar is.
Yeah.
And that's okay. It's still a great book, and that doesn't mean you can never read Bell Jar. And that was the other book that you said.
You should read the Bell Jar, though, too. It's me.
You should read the Bell Jar.
Telling you to feel real sad and spend some time with Esther Greenwood. For all of my sad girlies out there, you might find your catharsis in wow, somebody else thinks these thoughts. Isn't that nice?
Yeah. I mean, that's I think literature's most essential power is empathy. Not only for the reader to develop empathy with the characters, but also for the author to say, I have empathy with you, and that your experience is not unique, and that's very beautiful.
Yeah. And the Bell Jar is incredible, but also breaks my heart in 17 million different ways. And in some ways, I relate to that book on a lot more of a deep personal level, but it's way more fun to talk about Carrie.
Oh my God.
It's way more fun to talk about her lighting all those assholes on fire than it is of just Esther Greenwood trying to live and navigate the world.
Because Esther Greenwood does not get revenge.
Yeah. Maybe that's what we need for the Bell Jar movie. Just Esther going absolutely batshit on everybody. That's what the people want.
I just read for this show a couple weeks ago, Count of Monte Cristo, a great revenge narrative. Yeah. And maybe we need more of that actually culturally, because that's a unique kind of catharsis. Well, is there anything, before I read I usually do the final paragraph, that you would like to plug, where you'd like to be found?
Find me online. I'm terminally online. My fancy professional website is just katehagen.co, but you can also find me in a more accessible way on mostly Blue Sky and Instagram these days at That Hagen Girl, ThatHagengrrl. I'm also on my friend Kristen Lopez's podcast in the month of March, talking about the great baby boom starring Diane Keaton. So if you want the two sides of Kate Hagen,
hell yeah,
you can listen to me talk about baby boom. Find me around town. I go to a lot of rep screenings. Come say hey. You can tell me what you think about The Rage Carrie 2 or any other adaptations of this wonderful book.
And then we'll go to this last paragraph, which is this letter from an Appalachian woman. Well, I must go and do a wash, so give my best to Rich and take care to send us some pictures when you can. Still, our Annie is awful pretty, and her eyes are as bright as buttons. I bet she'll be a real world beater someday. All my love, Melia. Okay. Dang.
What if no? I'm not going to do that. I was going to be like, what Annie is? Annie Wilkes. I'm not going to do that galaxy braid. But I do love, you touched on this shared Stephen King universe. I feel like he was doing that years before anybody else was doing it. And you see it, the more Stephen King you read, the more you see it. He's obsessed with characters wearing a blue chambray work short, which is so particular and such a specific detail. Yeah. And I love that. I hope somewhere he's got a story map, a location map where he has routed all these connections across all the novels and time space. But thanks for your wonderful curse brain, Stephen.
Well, I bet she'll be a world beater someday. The end.
Yay.